testing of samples, and compliance measures. It relied a little bit on foreign inspections. The foreign facility registration primarily provided a list of what firms to expect. There was a reliance to some degree on export programs of other countries and a few bilateral agreements and arrangements. And so why Foreign Supplier Verification Program? The short version is the system that existed prior to the Food Safety Modernization Act failed. It failed to protect the U.S. public. There were a rising number of deaths, illnesses, and recalls for imported food, such as fresh produce, processed foods, and most singularly in 2007, wheat gluten and rice protein concentrate that were adulterated with melamine and related chemicals that led to the death of some 9,000 household pets. The failure of the existing tools was evident. Part of the reason is the resources available for FDA to screen imports were inadequate. The actual number of entries that were examined, this just means at least an investigator looked at the product, was less than 0.5% of the number of lines being entered in a year's time. And unsurprisingly, there were zero prospects for large budget increases to augment what had been in existence at the time. So the U.S. Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it has a number of pieces that relate to the import of food. The two we're going to talk about are the ones in blue, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and Systems Recognition or Equivalence Assessments. Others include, though, the Foreign Supplier Verification, the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, requiring use of accredited laboratories, third-party certification, and requiring import certificates. Those are not yet in effect. Now, on officially recognized national food safety authorities, under systems recognition, FDA and these three countries, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia, have entered into mutual agreements to accept the food safety inspections conducted under their respective authorities as equivalent to those conducted by the domestic food agency. So an inspection by New Zealand's, or rather on behalf of New Zealand's Ministry of Primary Industries, would be considered by the Food and Drug Administration to be as good as an inspection made by an FDA investigator in New Zealand, and vice versa. The same for Canada's Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Australia's Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. Systems recognition applies only to finished foods, not to foods being imported into the U.S. for further processing. Now, to date, there have been no tangible benefits to FDA entry screening criteria, and there may not. The rate at which goods from these countries are examined by FDA is probably not high to begin with, but it may not be markedly lower anytime in the immediate future. There is a future promise, though, that inspections by these authorities are going to be accepted as verification measures to document that the goods being imported from manufacturers under these inspectional schemes are going to be considered equivalent to an FDA inspection for verification purposes. The Foreign Supplier Verification Program has a domestic counterpart, the Supply Chain Program, and it was not provided for in the Food Safety Modernization Act, but is necessary for compliance with World Trade Organization agreements. Congress mandated the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. FDA built the Supply Chain Program to be the domestic equivalent. It's located in a different part of the regulation in 21 CFR 117 subpart G, whereas the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule is in part 1 subpart L of the Code of Federal Regulations. It's intended to accomplish the same result, that the buyer knows the seller is providing goods that are safe. And compliance with a supply chain program is accepted as compliance with a foreign supplier verification program. An Italian colleague asked, why is the importer responsible for assuring food is safe, imported food is safe? Since U.S. manufacturers are responsible for food safety, why not make foreign manufacturers equally responsible? Pardon me for a second. The short answer is FDA has no authority over foreign entities, but FDA does have authority over U.S. importers and imported food. That is why the Foreign Supplier Verification Program applies requirements to importers of food. Now, this also implies that importers of food will be asking foreign suppliers for information and verification that the goods produced are in compliance with FDA regulations. And at this point, let me turn it over to Susan.
I wanted to pick up on what Charles was talking about. And again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon what time of day it is in your part of the world. What we want to do now is go into some of the details, and there is quite a lot of detail involved in the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. First and foremost, what the individual programs will look like depends on some of the other rules that were passed in the Food Safety Modernization Act. There were 7 foundational, they're called foundational rules, and the ones that you see there in italics have dependencies for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. That's to say, what needs to be done for one supplier depends on what area they come in and how they come under the umbrella of another one of those programs. And so what we're going to do is get into some of these details at this time. First and foremost, regardless of the type of program that a foreign supplier prevention program would look like, there are some words that continue to appear in the regulation. And that is that foreign suppliers have to provide the same level of public health protection as would be required in the U.S. under FSMA. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have a HACCP plan or this plan or that plan. They just have to be able to document that what they are doing provides the same level of public health protection. So that's one key phrase to think about as you look at the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rules. The other piece is that all food is affected that is regulated by the FDA unless there's an exemption. And we will be talking about those exemptions because there are quite a few exemptions and modifications as we go through this next part of the webinar. And what I would suggest for those of you that can download the slide set that we have, that you do that, because some of these details are going to get a little bit specific, and you might want to make some notes and keep these slides as a reference for the future. Another thing to look at is that supplier and food are a combo, so that for each food that's brought into the United States, there needs to be a foreign supplier that is approved for the food. For example, if you are importing cashews, for example, from Central America, you may have a food safety program or some type of program around that, and you would approve that supplier. Would you approve that same supplier for coconut? Well, you have to look at the food safety plans. Inasmuch as foods can be grouped into a category with the same food safety plan, you can do that. But otherwise, you have to approve the supplier for the food. So each food has to have a specific approval or group of foods, as they say. Here are some of the exemptions. Anybody bringing in fish or seafood is exempt. The regulations that you've been under for many years now for HACCP for fish and seafood apply, so there is no need to comply with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Same thing for juice and juice products. That would be 100% juice and juice concentrates. If you are currently in a HACCP program, you are exempt. So that program is considered an exemption. you don't have to comply with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. If you're bringing in food for a pilot study or some kind of test run, then you do not have to comply with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. However, you do have to be able to document that that food will not enter commerce and that the food is for research or evaluation. And in the fourth bullet point, if you're bringing in alcoholic beverages or any type of ingredient such as extracts that are going to be used for flavoring alcohol, then you are also exempt. So right there are several categories of products where the Foreign Supplier Verification Program does not apply. There's another exemption for importers that may just send a small amount of goods to the United States. And as you see there on the slide, it's prepackaged food that requires no other packaging or intervention before it goes to the market. And it's a very small amount that that importer brings into the United States, less than 5%. When thinking about this exemption, I was trying to come up with an example, and I think maybe one good example might be some cheeses from France, for example. The market for those cheeses is principally France. They may import a small amount of their goods to the U.S. for gourmet stores. It's not more than 5% of their sales, so they would be covered under that particular exemption. And then another exemption is that anything that's just passed through from the United States to another country. For example, if Canada is importing tomatoes from Mexico and they are trucked through the U.S., then they are exempt. They would just transship and be delivered to the location in Canada. So anything that's just a pass-through is also exempt. So these exemptions are lining up. So there's a lot of products that where the FSVP does not apply. Also, any product that's regulated by USDA, meat, poultry, and liquid egg products. Anything that's imported for personal consumption. So if you're bringing something in for your family or for your office, if it's not going into commerce, personal consumption, that is exempt. The third bullet point, which is an interesting one, food that is exported from the U.S. and then rejected for whatever reason from the foreign port and returned to the U.S. That food clearly is exempt because it was produced in the United States. However, having talked to some of the FDA inspectors regarding that third bullet point, they did provide a caveat, and that is that there have been cases, and they have a flag on this, where food is actually produced in a foreign country with a U.S. label, and it's labeled as transshipped for import purposes in order to avoid tariffs. So that particular example or that particular case that would fall under the third bullet point is one which FDA has been monitoring, for some time. But anything that truly is imported, or made in the United States and then rejected at the foreign port and brought back is exempt. The last bullet point on this slide, food from small suppliers. This is where the importer who's organizing the FSVP has to look at one of the other rules to see whether its supplier qualifies under a small supplier in the preventive control rule or the produce rule. So again, all of these rules can be involved in any particular FSVP program. Just moving on now, we have the exemptions. Now this group is a group of US-based organizations where their importers are deemed to be in compliance. They're not exempt, but they're deemed to be in compliance. And these are receiving facilities. Receiving facilities are direct importers who bring in the goods and then also manufacture and process the goods. So they're bringing in ingredients directly and processing them. If they are covered by the preventive control rules for human food, or in the case of animal food, for animal food, if they have their supply chain preventive control program, as Charles was talking about a little earlier, or if they're actually controlling the hazard in their facility, then they're deemed to be in compliance. Again, this particular part of the regulation applies to direct importers who are also food processors, manufacturers. If they're not required to be under the PC rules, there are a couple of provisions around these rules where there is an exemption from these other rules, such as the preventive control rule. For example, foods that cannot be consumed without some type of processing. Raw coffee beans, for example, or raw kidney beans, those kinds of foods. They're deemed, the receiving facilities, that is the processor, is deemed to be in compliance because the food that they're bringing in cannot be consumed without some kind of intervention. Coffee is probably the best example. Someone who's importing raw coffee beans is deemed to be in compliance because raw coffee beans aren't used. You've got to have the roasting procedure. So that would be, again, not an exemption, but an assumed compliance. The other assumed compliance is that you're going to be processing the food and your customer is going to be processing the food to control the hazards. The example we have here, you're importing raw pineapple, but you know that that raw pineapple is going to a canning facility where the hazards will be controlled. So that would be that you're deemed to be in compliance. Again, it gets quite detailed here. So, for example, if you are bringing in food as an importer and your customer is going to control the hazard, such as the case of the pineapple that we just discussed, then the full compliance with the program is not required, but you have to have some correspondence back and forth between the importer and the customer. That is to say, you as the importer have to communicate to the customer that you have not controlled the hazard. And the customer has to communicate to you that they are controlling the hazard. So the full-blown FSVP is not required, but this handshake of communication is required in cases where the customer is going to be controlling the hazard. Even though the customer is controlling the hazard, you have to identify yourself. There's a database at Customs and Border Patrol called the ACE database, and so there are some entries that the database requires, and one of them is to identify the FSVP importer. So you still have to do that. Even though you're in compliance, you have to identify in the database as the FSVP importer. And as an aside, FDA indicates that they have notified all of those filers at the import locations of this change in the database management, that they will have to enter these particular fields for the foreign supplier verification program. So we did exemptions, we did those that were deemed to be in compliance, and now we're going to move forward and talk about some where there's a modified compliance requirement. Dietary supplements first and foremost. There are two tiers here. First of all, if you are importing a finished good, if the capsule or the tablet or the other product is being made completely overseas and shipped to you, then you have to ascertain that that foreign supplier is in compliance with the dietary supplement regulation under 21 CFR Part 111. And that includes shipments in bulk, even if you're packaging in the United States. So you've got a finished dietary supplement. It's incumbent upon you as the importer to make sure that your supplier is in compliance with Part 111 regulations. If you're a manufacturer of dietary supplements and you're bringing in ingredients to make in your products that are produced in the United States, then you're deemed to be in compliance if you follow the 21 CFR Part 111 regs for dietary supplements. So again, there's two tiers there for supplements. In both of those tiers, however, there has to be that entry in the database that you are the foreign supplier verification importer. Another modified requirement, if you're bringing in a low acid canned food, that's to say, you know, a pickle or a soup that's acidified or salsa or something like that, you are exempt from the microbiological requirements. You're not exempt from the hazard assessment for physical hazards and chemical hazards. And then finally, small importers. If you're a small operator for human food, that's less than $1 million a year. For animal food and feed, it's less than $2.5 million US per year. You have a modified requirement. And that is, again, you do not have to get a full-blown FSVP program, but you do have to get written assurance every 2 years that your supplier is in compliance with processes and procedures that provide the same level of public health protection as required in the U.S. So if you are an importer and your human food load each year is less than $1 million US, then all you need to do is get that written assurance every 2 years that your supplier is in compliance with local laws and has the same level of public health protection as required in the United States. Again, what that letter, what that communication from your supplier needs to include is, again, a brief description of what they're doing. Is it a HACCP plan? Is it something else? And then a statement that they are in compliance with the local regulations in the country of origin. Small suppliers, okay, we had small importers just now, then we're talking about small suppliers. So if you're importing from a farm that does very little business, US dollars each year, or egg producer, very small egg producer, then you come under another modification. If you're a qualified facility, again, if you have less than $1 million in annual sales, or food sales averaging less than $500,000 per year during the last 3 years, then you're qualified under the other rule, the Preventive Controls rule for human food. And for those facilities, you have a lesser requirement, a modified requirement. For animal food, it's $2.5 million. So we talked about the small importers, now we're talking about the small facilities, the small suppliers. Again, it's the same requirement. You have to have written assurance before the food is imported, and then again every 2 years that the food is in compliance with local regulations and offers the same level of public health protection as required in the United States. So as you can see, I would imagine from these slides, there are lots of twists and turns and lots of different attributes for a foreign supplier verification program, depending on who you are as an importer and who your supplier is as a supplier. So that for that reason, I suggested that you download these slides and kind of maybe use it as a reference as you begin to parse through what you need to do as part of the foreign supplier verification program. And again, for small suppliers, just as small importers, there needs to be that correspondence from the supplier indicating that they have some type of preventive controls and describe that, and that they are in compliance with their local jurisdiction, with their local laws. There is another twist to the FSVP as well that modifies the rule for those produce manufacturers that are not covered under the produce rule. And again, it's the same idea. Every 2 years, a letter indicating they're in compliance with local law and providing the same level of public health protection as is offered in food produced in the United States. Take a look at this list. These foods are not covered by the produce safety rule. So anything that's being brought in these categories, not covered by the produce safety rule, you need that 2-year letter. Every 2 years, a letter from your supplier that they're in compliance with local regulations and that they have a processing system that offers the same level of public health protection as is required in the United States. Raw agricultural facilities, silos, grain elevators, storage facilities that are storing food other than fruits and vegetables are not required to comply with the Preventive Controls rule under FSMA. But if you're bringing these items in from silos and storage facilities, then you still need to have that 2-year letter from the supplier that they are offering the same level of public health protection, as is in the United States. Examples here, hulling nuts, shelling nuts, drying nuts, packing nuts, all of those holding activities do not need to be covered in the Preventive Controls rule, but there does need to be some foreign supplier verification activity. Okay, Charles talked about these modified requirements. There are 3 countries that are considered to have equivalence: New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. So for finished goods coming from those countries, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is modified. There still has to be an entry in the database, and the importer has to make some determination that the supplier has complied with the local rules in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. So there's 2 things there. The foreign supplier has to be identified in the Customs and Border Patrol database, and the importer has to have verification that the supplier is in compliance with the rules in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand. Again, it's the Systems Recognition Initiative, and it only applies right now to finished product, anything that's packaged. So an importer bringing ingredients from Canada, Australia, or New Zealand for further processing, it does not yet apply. And Charles went into a little bit of detail around that earlier in this webinar. So basically, for now, for finished products, the importer has to document that there is an equivalent food safety system in place and the food is in that scope, and the supplier is in compliance with the scope of that Canadian, Australian, or system in New Zealand. Okay, as we wind down now, we're going to look at some of the compliance dates. And once again, when you have to be compliant with a foreign supplier verification program depends on when your supplier has to be compliant with these other programs if the supplier has to be compliant with these other programs. Again, it's the foreign supplier that drives the date of compliance, not the importer. So once the foreign supplier is required to be in compliance with this law, you've got 6 months as an importer to come up to speed and to bring your FSVP program online. May 30th, which just passed us a couple of weeks ago, is for suppliers who are not subject to any of the rules. However, again, as we said earlier, if you're required to comply with those rules, you've got a varying schedule of dates. If you're a qualified facility, you've got 2 more years to go, just about. If you are importing anything that's involved with grade A milk products under the pasteurized milk ordinance, you have again 2 years. Anybody else, again, you had to be in compliance in the last 3 weeks or so. For animal food, small businesses, next year March, qualified businesses, March of 2019, and anybody else had to be in compliance. So the large processors of animal food, the large processors of human food had to be in compliance by May 30th of this year. Under the produce rule, again, you've got more compliance time. The large businesses have to be in compliance as of July next year. Small and very small businesses have an additional 1 or 2 years to be in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. If you are importing food contact substances, such as napkins or packaging or food contact labeling, you have until May of 2019. If you are looking at your customer to control the hazard in your food, you have another extended date for compliance. For large facilities, it's September of next year. For the PC rule, which gives you 6 months to comply with the FSVP rule, which is March of 2019. Again, this is a lot of list of do's and don'ts and a lot of intricacies and variation in compliance states, as well in programs that you would use to be in compliance. That pretty much ends what we have discussed today. I would imagine that there would be some questions on some of these details, so I think that we will open it up for questions at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Moyers. We do have a few questions. The first question we have is, a lot of Indian players export food grains to U.S., including basmati and non-basmati rice, lentils, etc. These food grains are sourced/aggregated from various sources, i.e. milled to get grains at a facility which is not a farm. Do the importers of these food grains need to comply with FSVP, or are they exempt? Do these food grains need to comply with produce safety or PCHF rule?
The rice and lentils are milled, which is to say they are now no longer a raw agricultural product, but they are both foods that cannot be consumed without further processing. So they are covered under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, but the coverage can be one of the deemed to be in compliance examples that Susan offered, in that the importer can document that the food cannot be consumed without further preparation, and they need to know that the exporter is producing the goods in compliance with good manufacturing practice regulations. In this instance, it would be a relatively low burden for the importer to be able to document that the goods do comply with FDA requirements.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is, would the exemption on slide 14 apply to trade show samples?
I don't have slide 14 up. Is that the evaluation?
There we go. Can you see 14 now?
Yes. Do you want to take that one, Susan?
prepackaged food that prevents any, well, if it's going to a trade show, it's not being sold. Is that correct?
But it would be consumed by, or could be consumed by trade show attendees, in which case it would be covered under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Whether or not it would fall under an exemption for constituting not more than 5% of the overall sales would need to be documented.
Correct, yeah. So regardless of whether it's being sold on the marketplace or being sold or passed out at a trade show, if it's less than 5% of that company's product, then it would be exempt. In other words, the trade show designation doesn't mean anything here. You know, the fact that it's going to a trade show, it's still not more than 5%.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, are low-acid canned foods, LACF, in their final package exempt from FSVP?
No, but as long as the facility that canned them is in compliance with the low-acid canned food good manufacturing practice requirements, then that is evidence that the goods are in compliance with U.S. requirements. So for an importer of a low-acid canned food from outside the United States, their verification program could be evidence from an inspection, possibly from a recognized authority or from someone else, possibly from FDA, that the goods were made in conformance with the canned food requirements, and that would be verification that they do meet U.S. requirements.
So if the goods are in compliance with the canning low-acid canned foods regulations, they are exempt from microbiological hazards. The importer would still have to receive documentation that there was a control of physical hazards and chemical hazards in that process. So the importer would need visibility to their plan.
Okay. Next question is, the FSVP appears to be aiming at solving the food quality issues, yet with so many exemptions, what is the purpose? Very few manufacturers from abroad sell more than 5% of their total sales in U.S. Hence, billions of dollars of food will still flow in with no control. Why so many exemptions?
FDA did what it could with the law that it had. The exemptions were written into the law. They're not, in large part, they are not at FDA's discretion.
Okay. Next question is, how does preventing intentional adulteration factor into the FSVP?
It does not. Intentional adulteration is covered under a different set of regulations that, I forget the number, but within the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, adulteration for economic gain that may cause harm is covered.
Okay. Next question. Oh, sorry.
Any facility, regardless of their size or what they're producing, has to produce food that's in compliance with the U.S. laws, and the U.S. laws prevent adulteration, so that any kind of adulteration is and has been covered under existing rules. Under the preventive control rules for human food and animal food, the hazard analysis that has to take place must take into consideration the history and the likelihood of intentional adulteration that involves safety. So it's concerning safety. So if someone is adding a color or changing some type of ingredient that doesn't involve safety, it's not covered.
Okay, next question is, if you are a dietary supplement manufacturer in Canada, What is a compliance date, and are they considered to have an equivalent safety system? The manufacturer would have a site license from Health Canada, not CFIA. In other words, the license is even more stringent than the food regulations, since in Canada, dietary supplements are considered a subset of drugs.
The Canadian manufacturer pointed out why it isn't covered under the mutual recognition initiative by saying that it is inspected by Health Canada, not CFIA. The Canadian dietary supplement manufacturer would be required to let the importer know everything that was necessary to document that the dietary supplements are in compliance with Part 111, the Dietary Supplement Good Manufacturing Practice Regulations. Or if it's not a complete finished dietary supplement, they would still, or the importer would still be responsible for assuring it's meeting U.S. requirements.
So in being in compliant with the regulations of Health Canada, there is a equivalency there, but that's not recognized under the FSVP. However, the requirements for Health Canada and the compliance with those requirements would have to be sent to the importer of the dietary supplement product.
Okay, next question is, can you reconfirm and clarify if the importer of, for example, vitamin or preservative to be used in food products comes under this program?
Absolutely. The food ingredients are included in the mix of products that are covered under the FSVP. If it's a vitamin that's being used to fortify food, then it would come under the FSVP under the PC rule, and if it's a vitamin that's going into a dietary supplement, it would come under Part 111 and the PC rule for the U.S. manufacturer.
Okay, next question is, in regards to dietary ingredients, when buying products from distributors that import themselves, do they need to provide their import documentation?
Yes. And that's one of the issues that may come up with some importers of dietary supplements, because they have to make sure that the country of origin is in compliance with Part 111, which, is the dietary supplement rule. And as one of the questions mentioned, it really is kind of a hybrid rule between drugs and food. So it's incumbent on the importer to ascertain that those rules are being complied with for the finished dietary supplement.
Okay, next question is, what provides more protection / guarantee in terms of food safety / quality for consumption? IFS / BRS / GFSI, HACCP, FDA so far, USDA, organic and similar certificates, or FSVP?
Well, the FSVP and these regulations, all of the regulations, are not concerned with quality. They're concerned with safety. So quality is a completely different issue. In terms of the GFSI schemes, SQF, BRC, IFS, and all of those schemes, they, for the most part, would almost be in compliance, but there are some differences. And the individual scheme owners, for the most part, at least with BRC and SQF, have identified those differences and have included them in addenda to their documents used in an audit. But it's not the same. FSMA compliance or FSVP compliance is not the same as being GFSI compliant.
But they are close.
Right, they're close, but again, there are gaps and probably always will be gaps. One of the scheme owners that I was talking to in the last couple of months said, you know, we can't possibly be totally compliant with the U.S. laws, because then if we do that, then we're going to have to be totally compliant with the Australian laws, with the French laws, with the EU laws, and so that takes away from GFSI completely. So there will probably always be gaps between the GFSI programs and the individual country regulations.
Okay, so the next question is related to that, and it's kind of answered, but it's, do GFSI recognized standards like IFS or BRC cover the requirements of FSVP?
They are,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
they are evidence of compliance, but they are not evidence of complete compliance. So the answer is almost, but not quite.
Yeah, let me give you one example of where it doesn't quite comply. In the requirements under the PC rule, the verification that you would use in a HACCP plan or verification you would use in a food safety plan, under the PC rule, verification has to be done within 7 days of the occurrence. So if you're verifying a CCP in a HACCP plan, that has to be done within 7 days. None of the GFSI schemes require that 7-day parameter. They require verification, but they don't require verification within 7 days. So that gap exists. That's just one example. There are several, but they're small. So I would say that anybody who is compliant with any of the GFSI schemes is about 95% of the way there, if not more, but there's still gaps.
Okay, and this will be the last question unless anyone would like to chime in before we conclude the webinar. The last question is, the 5% of overall sales of the facility exemption is unclear. Does this mean that 5% of overall sales of the foreign facility or 5% of the importer's overall sales?
Foreign facility.
Okay. Looks like that is our last question. Thank you, Mr. Breen and Dr. Moyers, for providing an informative session. For those in the audience, this webinar was recorded and will be available for viewing by the end of this week. If you would like to view it or learn more about other upcoming EAS events, please visit our website at easconsultinggroup.com. And again, thank you so much for attending our webinar.